Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week as I just kind of do work with the text. And I move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason that I do these videos. The second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. So that is why I do these things. That came out weird. This particular Sunday, which is October 9th, 2016, the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, also my brother's birthday. Not that that affects you a great deal unless you happen to be my brother. Yeah, all that. The assigned gospel text for this week comes out of Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. Now, this actually picks up right where we left off last week. Jesus is still in the travel narrative, which began way back in Luke's gospel, heading towards Jerusalem. His face has been turned towards Jerusalem, and we're actually getting close now. He arrives in chapter 19, so we're getting there. We're getting real close. What's interesting is that his travel discourse, as he's been traveling around with his face turned towards Jerusalem, he's been all over the place. So apparently his face is turned towards Jerusalem as he walks different directions. That's a digression. But we do see that actually at this point, it seems that his face being turned towards Jerusalem is actually now taking him there because we hear he's in the region between Galilee and Samaria. And if you're familiar with kind of the geography of Israel and where everything's at and where Jerusalem's at, Galilee's up in the north. Samaria is kind of down just south of that or to the southwest of that. And then Jerusalem is farther down, even farther to the south. So it seems that he's leaving his home stomping grounds of the region of Galilee, which is where he oftentimes is, and heading now down towards Jerusalem. And now this portion that I'm about to read is actually the end of chapter 17. Then in chapter 18, he's still traveling, and we actually hear he ends up in Jericho, and Jericho is down in the south, quite a bit closer to Jerusalem, and then in chapter 19 he'll actually arrive in Jerusalem. So that's kind of where we're at geography-wise and travel-wise and narrative-wise. That's kind of what's going on. So with all that being said, let's jump in. On the way to Jerusalem, so okay, awesome. Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee, which I already mentioned. As he entered a village, and we don't know what village, he's just entering a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And they went, and as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Okay, so that's the story there. I mistakenly said a little bit ago that this story ends chapter 17. It doesn't. There's still some other stuff going on there, so a little minor correction there. But okay, so that's the gospel this week. So we hear some different things. We know where we are geographically. Now, the region of Galilee and the region of Samaria, neither one of them are overly large. In terms of where exactly they're at, we don't really know, and it's a little ambiguous in the original language as to, like, are they on the border? Not to say that there really is a border, but he just kind of out in the sticks that are kind of between these two areas. Here in southwest Iowa or in rural Iowa, we have a town about every 10 miles, 10, 12 miles, sometimes closer. But as I've looked at maps, that's kind of what I think of if we had a center of Galilee and a center of Samaria. He's kind of in the area. It'd be like he's traveling from town to town, basically. But the thing to remember is that the relationship between Jewish people and Samaritans is not good. And I've talked about this in videos before, so if you're a regular viewer, you've probably heard me say this, but they don't get along. Samaritans are the remnants or the descendants of people that had during the Assyrian exile, which was way back, like several hundred, many hundred years, about 1,000 years, or maybe not, well, many hundreds of years before Jesus was born. So the Assyrians came over and took over the northern kingdom of Israel, also called the kingdom of Samaria at times, and they hauled off some of the people into exile, and they brought some of their people in, and they intermingled and intermarried with the Jewish people there, and the resulting descendants were called Samaritans. Well, the Jewish people consider them to be half-breeds, consider them to be riffraff. They don't get along real well. The feeling is mutual. The Samaritans don't really like the Jewish people either. They worship the same God, but they do so differently, and they do so in different places. So that's kind of an interesting little dynamic that goes on there too. But so basically, in addition to Samaria, also keep in mind that Jesus is coming from Galilee, and Jesus is a Galilean, and they're considered kind of backwater people too. They're also Jewish people, but they're kind of like backwater ragamuffins, I oftentimes call them. That's kind of the consideration of that. So both of these groups would have been, or like people from those regions would have been considered like uncouth. And so we have that happening. And then as Jesus is going into this village, he sees these lepers. Now, leprosy referred to a lot of different things back in Jesus' day and even before that. And it's not necessarily the disease that still exists in parts of the world now, but and causes flesh to rot away. But leprosy would be applied, or the name leprosy would be applied to many different like skin afflictions that someone comes down with. Now it could clear up and go away, in which case then the person could be declared clean again by a priest, and we kind of hear hints of that, and they can come back into their normal lives. But it's within the Old Testament law that if someone is found to be leprous, they have to leave the town. They have to go out of town for a period of time and see if it clears up, and then they have to check back in with the priest, and if it is cleared up, then they're declared clean, or they can go through the process of being cleansed and things of that nature. So that's why these 10 lepers are outside of town. And the requirement is that they stay out of the community. They have to cover their upper lip. So it's kind of like this. You almost think of these guys like vampires, like blah, blah, blah. But they have to announce their presence from a distance. They have to unclean, 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 so that the clean person that they're encountering can stay away from them and not be made unclean themselves and potentially catch whatever affliction is going on with the person. So they're kept out. Among those 10, this one guy is also a Samaritan. We assume, it's not stated, but we assume that the other 9 are probably Jewish people, likely Galilean lepers. But because of that, these 10 guys are all cast out into this, this wilderness region between the two regions, or this wilderness area between the two regions, and misery loves company, so they're kind of banded together. Lepers can be around lepers. And yet this one guy would have been the outcast among outcasts, and yet he's the one that, as we hear throughout the course of the story, that expresses faith. Jesus encounters them. They ask him for mercy. They don't necessarily ask to be healed, but what else do we think that they could be asking for? And Jesus tells them essentially, well, go show yourself to the priests. And then we don't actually hear about the healing itself. They're going, and we hear just the brief snippet that as they were going to the priest, they were healed. Now, we don't know what happens to the 9 guys. We don't know if they are like, once they notice that they're healed, they're like, oh, well, we're good to go. Do they go to the priest to be declared clean, and then they go back about their regular lives? That's likely what happened, although we don't know. And yet then we've got this one guy, and did he go to the priest to be declared clean, and then he comes back to thank Jesus? Again, we don't know. The details there are pretty ambiguous, but what seems to be happening is that Jesus returns them to some sense of normalcy. Being clean now, having the healing of the leprosy, they can go back to normal life. And the thing that rattles around in my head, it's based on three different Greek words, three different actions. We hear that they are cleansed of their leprosy, whatever that is. We also then hear that they are healed, which those two are very, very similar, but that's what happens to all of them. All 10 of them are cleansed and healed of what ails them. And yet the faith of the one that we hear comes back praising God and thanking God for what God has done. The faith of that one has made him well or made him whole or has saved him. That's what the Greek says there. Only the one that expresses, that shows signs of faith. So as I've been thinking about this, the notion of Jesus tells them to basically go back to normal. And the priests, who will then declare them clean, can restore them to their normal lives, can put them back into the status quo, back into the reunion of relationship, the reunion of community, with family, whatever. All that is restored for all 10, not just the one, but for all 10. To be healed, the ailment is gone, which again, that's part of being cleansed, but that's kind of up to nature. And if you think of any sort of disease, well, your body either fights it off or medicine or whatever. But it's kind of up to whatever is causing the sickness. Nature, essentially, perhaps with the help of medicine or medical help or whatever, basically allows that to happen. So that's up to nature. Being cleansed or being announced as cleansed, in the case of the lepers, is up to the priests. Being healed is kind of up to nature, although yes, it's Jesus who does it. And yet the faith makes the guy whole, saves him. For him, there is a new normal. And that's kind of the sense that we see in the direction that I think I'm going to go with the sermon. That he now, normal for him, normal life, status quo, has been affected. And that's because of the presence of faith in his life. Faith in what? Well, faith in Christ, faith in God, gratitude for that which God has done. That's a notion. And maybe we hear that he's a Samaritan, he's an outsider. There's a lot of different speculation, and I could spend a lot of time talking about that. I'm not really going to, but maybe we hear that he is a Samaritan because, as the outsider among outsiders, he has experienced that double batch of the miracle. That not only are the outsiders like blessed, but he's been doubly blessed. And so that which has been the one who has been forgiven much. Loves much. We actually hear that in Scripture, and he's had a double batch of mercy, a double batch of grace of God, and that's why it affects him so much, and why his gratitude is shown. So that's kind of the direction that I'm going. This notion that the presence of faith allows us to see the presence of the kingdom of heaven, which has come into our reality through Christ. To see that in the midst of the day-to-day. I'm kind of scattered, and I know this maybe isn't coming out super clear, but for the 9 guys, they're able to return to normal. The presence of faith in God creates a new normal for this guy, and he expresses his gratitude because of that. And I think very much about the notion of how do we respond to God's grace when it really affects us? And I've actually had some interesting conversation through social media about this in the last 24 hours. So that's kind of in my head that the grace of God is not about what we do, but it's about what God has done and for us and says about us. And then how do we respond to that? Is our life, is our existence changed, altered because of the amazing thing that God has done? And for the Samaritan guy, that seems to be the case. And I think that's the example that we cling to. So in my opinion, that's kind of what's happening with this passage. If you have thoughts, questions, or comments, by all means, pop those down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.